So I would like to thank Valerie and the organizers of the meeting for this invitation. I'm going to be speaking on the emotional health of war journalists. It's a topic that I became interested in about 20 years back after a patient was referred to my clinic. The woman had a conversion disorder, and she turned out to be a war journalist who did very well with therapy and made a good recovery. And I remember her telling me that she had not reached out for help over a number of years, even though she knew that she was feeling emotionally unwell. And when I asked her why, she told me that I did not understand her profession, that had she told her boss back in the newsroom that she was feeling depressed, anxious, they would have pulled her from this work and she would never have been able to do it again. I was surprised by this punitive way of dealing with things, and went and did a literature search to see what was written on this topic. And to my surprise, I couldn't find a single article devoted to war, journalism, stress, and emotional health. And that prompted me to write a grant application and send it to the Freedom Forum in Washington, DC. And remember, this was 1999, pre 9/11, when the world was in a different way. And in fact, I got the grant. It was very easy, easiest grant I ever got. And that started me on this journey of looking at journalists and their emotional health. So the aims of my talk are the following: to appreciate the dangers faced by journalists in war zones, to understand how these dangers translate into emotional problems, to highlight briefly the challenges for local journalists, to share some thoughts on moral injury, and to appreciate what motivates journalists to cover this work. And my funding sources have been the Freedom Forum, the Dart Foundation, BBC, CNN, and UNESCO. This cartoon just shows you how war journalism is becoming increasingly dangerous. In the lengthy First World War, only 2 correspondents were killed, and you can contrast that with this escalating death rate. The current conflict in Iraq has seen over 200 journalists killed, the majority being Iraqi journalists. When I started this work 21 years back, because there was nothing published on the topic, I went to fictional portrayals of war correspondents to try and understand the profession. And here are 2 examples of that. I also read a number of memoirs. The news at the time had been dominated by the collapse of the Balkans, and that was reflected in my reading as well. There'd also been the genocide in Rwanda, and some wonderful accounts of these horrors had been written by great correspondents. I also looked at movies, and here we see 2 of them, one in Nicaragua, and the other, I believe, in Indonesia. And then, of course, we have the quintessential war journalist, Tintin, who is frequently getting beaten up, kidnapped, but always seems to emerge unscathed and go back for more. So the question that I asked myself to begin with was, why was there a lack of empirical data? And in part, the reason can be found in the title of this memoir of Martha Gellhorn, who was a very great war journalist, Nothing Ever Happens to the Brave. And while that's a fine title for a book, it's simply not true. Some very awful things happen to brave journalists, as you will see. But I think by wrapping themselves in this cloak of immunity, news organizations, in a sense, were blind to what was going on with their staff. They saw themselves as neutral observers. They were not combatants. And so the attitude was they could swan in and out of war zones and emerge unscathed. And that's not true. So the first study I did was to actually define the problem. I had 2 groups of subjects, 170 war journalists. They came to me from the BBC, CNN, Reuters, Associated Press, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, the Rory Peck Trust. And you can see that there was a very healthy response rate. Over 80% wanted to take part. There was a control group of journalists who had never been to war. They were domestic journalists. And once again, a very good response rate from them. These were the conflicts that I looked at. And remember, the year was 1999, 2000. And you can see that the collapse of Yugoslavia and the civil war in the Balkans dominated this group. Down at the bottom where you see Afghanistan, that refers to Afghanistan under the Soviet occupation. And then you've got a number of African conflicts here as well. So really a who's who of conflict over the preceding 10 years. Here we've got some of the data with the war journalists in one column and the control journalists in the other column, and you can see that they are a young group in the late 30s, predominantly male, very experienced, 15 years doing this kind of work. And the only demographic difference between the two was that the war group were more likely to be single or divorced, which is not surprising given that this group spends 6 months away from home. Here we see the PTSD type data, and once again, no surprises over here. The war group in orange has a lot more re-experiencing, avoidance, and arousal symptoms, and a much higher total PTSD score. I did structured interviews on a subset of my sample, and the lifetime prevalence for post-traumatic stress disorder in this group was 28%, overlapping with the findings that we see in frontline veterans. Similarly, they had a higher rate of depression, the Beck depression scores, and the lifetime prevalence rate for major depression in this group was 20%, higher than the general population. Here we have the alcohol data divided according to sex. We know that the Canadian Medical Association recommends that men should not drink more than 14 units of alcohol per week, and women 9, and you can see that the war group in orange exceed this. And I put this cartoon up to try and deflect some of the heat that came away from the profession, because while journalists listened very carefully to my data, a number of them took issue with the alcohol figures. They felt that the upper limit of 14 drinks for a man per week or 9 for a woman was on the low side. I think in many ways this was the most significant finding to emerge from my study, that despite some journalists having more post-traumatic stress disorder and depression and drinking to excess, the war group were not more likely to have received psychological help than the non-war journalists. And it was this finding that was taken up by the news organizations. So I completed the study and went back to doing my multiple sclerosis work. And then this happened, September 11th. And this cartoon comes from a film made in the 1950s that was never released called They Came to Blow Up America. But then on 9/11, there was this catastrophe. And because of my single publication, which had been published in the American Journal of Psychiatry, suddenly, de facto, I became this expert on a topic. And after 9/11, I was invited out to New York by a news organization that was concerned about the health of their journalists. So they gave me an office within their bureau, and I sat there for a number of weeks, just speaking to journalists and providing counseling when necessary. But I also did some research. And so this news organization had 46 people in the bureau. 19 of them had been at the World Trade Center when the buildings came down. 17 had been in the newsroom covering it, and 10 had been out on the streets of New York covering different stories. Now remember, this was not a war journalism group. This was a group of domestic journalists. It was a very real event to them, of course. They had friends and colleagues and family members killed in the attack. They had friends and colleagues injured in the attack. So something that was very immediate. And the first thing that I did was I gave them a simple analog scale and asked them to rate their ability to cope with a disaster. And you can see the majority of people were doing well, but there was a subset over here who was not. And then I went and tapped into my previous data set to run a 3-way comparison. So we have here the 46 domestic journalists in New York post 9/11. From my original data, I extracted 45 domestic journalists who'd done their work pre 9/11, and then I extracted 45 war journalists. And I ensured that there was a good demographic match across the 3 groups with respect to age, sex, marital status, and years working. And here we see the PTSD data. And we have the war group in green, the domestic journalists pre 9/11 in mauve, and the domestic journalists post 9/11 in brown. And with respect to the intrusion and the avoidant and arousal symptoms that make up PTSD, you can see that the domestic journalists post 9/11 had a symptom severity and frequency rating very similar to the war group. Indeed, with respect to the arousal symptoms, it even exceeded the war group. But there is a there's a good outcome to this. I remained in touch with this bureau over the course of the next year, and with therapy and the absence of further threat, the brown columns returned all the way to baseline over here, where the mode group is. But the group that doesn't shift is the war group. Their scores remain persistently high because they are going back repeatedly to the world's most dangerous places. So with this out the way, I thought I would put this topic behind me, but then the war in Iraq started, and I got another commission from two news organizations, one British and one American, who asked me whether being an embedded journalist, in other words, if you were a journalist attached to a military unit, was that good for your emotional health or was it bad? And I couldn't answer it, but I said I would do a study, and so they funded that. And I worked with CNN and ITN. They gave me a list of 100 of their journalists, of whom, once again, 85% wanted to take part. And this is data that we collected from the trauma history questionnaire, which allowed us to look at lifetime exposure to life-threatening events. And these numbers are astounding. The embedded journalists, those attached to military units, or the unilateral, those who were working in Iraq without a military attachment, on average, these journalists have been exposed to about 22 events over the course of their career that could have killed them. And in the first month of the war in Iraq, the mean was 3. Similar in both groups, with a range of 0 to 10. So you can immediately see how hazardous this work was in after the onset of the war in Iraq. But there was no difference in exposure to trauma between the two groups. And so when we look at their behavioral responses with respect to post-traumatic stress disorder or depression or psychological distress measured on the general health questionnaire, there was no difference. Their scores were basically identical or close to identical. And so I was able to go back to the news organizations and say that soon after the war started in Iraq, it didn't really matter from a journalist's emotional health perspective, whether they were attached to the cavalry or the infantry, or whether they were just operating independently. And then what happened in Iraq after that? After 2005, it became very difficult to do this kind of research. This cartoon was given to me by Dexter Fulkins, who was working for the New York Times at the time, and he explained how the nature of the conflict had changed for journalism. So when the war began in 2003, down at the bottom of the pyramid, there was the greatest collection of foreign correspondents, war journalists in the history of conflict waiting to go into the country. More than 2,000 journalists were in Kuwait, knowing that the war was coming, just waiting to enter Iraq. And at first, they were regarded favorably by the local citizens. But then things started to change with the Ramadan offensive in late 2003, the rising of the Mahdi's army in 2004. And by the time the Fallujah offensive began in late 2004, it was extremely hazardous to be a journalist in Iraq. They were getting kidnapped, they were getting assassinated, they were being held for ransom. And so their numbers dropped dramatically. And so the kind of research that we had done at the beginning of the war was no longer possible on a group level, which meant that we had to shift into narrative and case history to find out what journalists were going through. And so this brings me to this woman, Giuliana Sgrena, an Italian journalist working for a communist newspaper who had traveled to Iraq 7 times alone to report on what civilians go through when war comes to their country. And then this is what happened to her.
Italian journalist Giuliana Sgrena was well known for her coverage of the civilian casualties of the war in Iraq. She was interviewing refugees from Fallujah when she was kidnapped.
I said to my kidnappers, we were there for people of Fallujah, just to let know what happened to the people of Fallujah, because up to now we have only the embedded journalists following the attack to Fallujah. And you kidnapped me. You are not interested in letting know what is happening in Fallujah, but they told me this is war.
As journalists, we're used to professional hazards, such as roadside bombs and getting caught in a crossfire. But you just don't want to imagine yourself at the mercy of a fundamentalist zealot who thinks killing you is his ticket to paradise.
And this is the sequel.
When Italian journalist Giuliana Screna was released after 4 weeks held hostage, her colleagues in Rome celebrated. But then shocking news arrived. The car taking her to freedom came under sudden attack by American soldiers. The Italian intelligence agent who had negotiated her release was shot while trying to protect Giuliana.
I had no chance to have this sensation of happiness for my freedom. And this is very hard for me because the death of Calipari and the fact that a man that was the man that it was the one that got my freedom, that liberated me from my kidnappers.
Celebration over Giuliana's release turned into a vigil for the slain intelligence officer.
When I realized that it was heavy and he was dying on my body, it's terrible. It's something that I could never forget.
So I went to Rome together with this colleague of mine, Mazio Bahari, a filmmaker, to make a documentary. And interviewing Giuliana, it became clear to me that while the surgeons had done a wonderful job putting her shoulder together, she had not received any kind of psychological counseling. And this brave woman had many symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. She, on her return to Rome, she could only sleep with the light on. She was reluctant to cross a street because she feared someone would deliberately run her over. Most importantly, she was unable to write, and she lived by her writing. She was a journalist. And when I asked her why she had not received any psychological care, she told me that when she got back, they said to her, "Don't worry about your emotions. With time, they get better." But of course, we know they don't, and people can suffer considerably with them. So let me switch now to some local journalists. I received a commission from UNESCO to go and look at journalists working in Mexico because there was grave concern that they were being targeted by the drug lords. And indeed they were. And I think what makes this study different is that to date, all my previous studies had focused on journalists who could fly in and out of conflict zones. But the Mexican journalists were different. They could not do this. They worked and lived in dangerous areas. And so this sets these findings apart. And I came across a situation in which journalists were facing extraordinary danger. We did the study in Spanish. Once again, a very good response rate to the questionnaires. And the bottom line is this: the cartels had learned that if you really want to intimidate a journalist, go after their families, which is what they were doing. They were targeting their children, their parents, their cousins, their grandparents. And the moment they did that, the level of trauma in the Mexican journalists ratcheted upwards. And you can see that once their families were threatened, they had more re-experiencing, avoidance and arousal, PTSD type difficulties, more depression, more social dysfunction. And the great irony was that this group, to self-medicate their distress, started to use illicit drugs. And we showed that 25% of our sample, in fact, had stopped working on a story because they were simply too traumatized or fearful to go on. And those journalists who stopped working on stories were once again experiencing more PTSD type symptoms, more depression. They were using hard drugs once again to self-medicate their distress. And this raised troubling questions about Mexican society, the freedom of the press, because when you've got such a substantial proportion of journalists too fearful to continue with their work, you really are undercutting one of the pillars of civil society. Since then, my group has gone on to do a number of studies with journalists working in the Balkans. I spoke about the Iraq War. We did a study in Israel. Spoke a bit about the Mexican data. We did a study in Syria, Kenya. We did a study looking at user-generated content. These are journalists who sit in newsrooms in London or New York, screening all the video material that comes in from the world's worst places. And this group finds this work very stressful. They can develop certain PTSD type difficulties by proxy, as it were. We did a study in Iran where the Iranian government really follows the model that the Mexican drug lords follow. They go after journalists' families to intimidate them, and the journalists themselves, of course. And then more recently, we did a study, once again, a commission from the International News Safety Institute looking at the refugee crisis in Europe. So this is what, in fact, we found. This was a study looking at the refugee crisis in Europe. Large numbers of refugees are on the move. UNHCR estimates 21 million back in 2015, most coming from Syria, Afghanistan, and Somalia. More than 30,000 people are displaced daily, and journalists are covering this migration. What we showed in this publication was that PTSD was not a problem in this group, but moral injury was. And moral injury is defined as the injury done to a person's conscience or moral compass when that person perpetrates, witnesses, or fails to prevent acts that transgress their own moral and ethical values or codes of conduct. So very little attention has been paid to moral injury, which I think is particularly relevant now as we battle the pandemic. So let me switch now to motivation and the personality traits that you can find in this group of war journalists. This is a quote from the great war photographer Robert Capa, who took this remarkable photograph of the D-Day landings. War in Europe over, absolutely no reason to get up in the morning anymore. So this was an individual who clearly thrived on the excitement and the drama of his work. And here we have this remarkable photograph of a glamorous woman in a bathtub, and you will notice that here we have Hitler's photograph, and this woman is or was the fashion photographer Lee Miller, who was also a war photographer. And at the end of the Second World War, when the Allies liberated Munich, she persuaded the American commander to let her into Hitler's apartment, where she went and took a bath in his bathtub. We see her combat boots over here. And she was also, of course, a bit of a risk taker. And at the end of the war, she went to her general practitioner complaining of feeling a bit unwell. And she got this response: "There is nothing wrong with you, and we cannot keep the world permanently at war just to provide you with excitement." So you can see this speaks to a certain personality style. To try and tease out what this is, we did this cognitive study in a group of final year journalism students at a university in Toronto. And we wanted to see whether we could predict in advance what their career trajectory would be. So we went in and gave them this well-known cognitive paradigm, the Iowa real-world gambling task, which will be familiar to you, the 4 decks of cards. Each deck is associated with a monetary reward, but also a forfeit. And you've got 100 trials to work out where can you make the most money from, decks A, B, C, or D. In the interest of time, I'm not going to play the test for you, but I'll show you the results. So the journalists did this, the journalism students did this test, and then we broke the code. And at the end, we asked them, okay, what's your career path? Are you going to stay home in Toronto, or are you going to go out into the world as a foreign correspondent? And these are the results. So the group in red refers to those students who do not want to become foreign correspondents. And you can see that over the course of 100 trials, they show a steady gain. They basically make money steadily. Here's the group that wants to become war journalists or foreign correspondents. And after 20 trials, you can see they are way ahead in terms of making money because they're hitting the decks associated with big wins. But embedded in those decks are big forfeits. And they keep on hitting those decks, and you can see that rather than gaining, they actually start losing money. And only towards the end is there some kind of self-correction. So what we see here are 2 different cognitive styles. And there's no difference between these 2 groups of students in terms of their grades or their intelligence. They just think about the world differently. The decision-making processes are different. And I would argue that you've got to have a personality style or a decision-making style that follows the blue trend if you want to be a foreign correspondent or a war journalist. You can't stay in your hotel and get the news. When you go to a dangerous place, you've got to get out in the field and get close to it. And by taking those kind of risks, there are, of course, forfeits. We see the forfeit over here in the lab, you lose money. But out in the field, the dangers, of course, are you could lose your life or you could be kidnapped. I just want to end up with one final study in which we looked at risk-taking in a pair of monozygotic twins. And over the course of my work in this field, I've come across a number of twins one of whom is a journalist and the other is not. And we looked at epigenetic personality traits in one set of these twins. And so these were the behavioral characteristics of the set of twins. One twin was a war journalist, left home at 16 years of age, lived in many countries, married late, no children. She drank beyond the CMA guidelines, and by her own admission, she wasn't good at managing money. And her co-twin was a law clerk, left home later, lived in one country, married early, had 2 children. She was drinking very little, and she managed money well. And we brought them into Toronto for a couple of days of testing. And I asked them to bring their photo albums, and we see the little twins that, after they were born, very cute, identical. We see them here with their elder sister. They grew up in a small English village. Their mother dressed them identically. They were known as 21 and 22. We see them here as adolescents. They're starting to differentiate a little. So when we look at risk-taking, this group has been called adrenaline junkies, but we know that the relevant neurotransmitter is not adrenaline, it's dopamine. And while we can't measure dopamine levels directly in the blood, we get a proxy for it through monoamine oxidase, which we can. And here we see the sisters outside Buckingham Palace. The war twin has received her OBE, and in fact, her monoamine oxidase levels were considerably lower than her co-twin. So by extension, we know that her dopamine levels are going to be higher, or her dopaminergic activity is going to be higher. And when we look at the epigenetic markers, well, first off, we confirmed they were monozygotic twins. And here we see, run a dividing line down these triangles. The red area refers to 9 sets of monozygotic twins whose behavioral characteristics were very similar. In the green, we see our set of twins, and you can see a divergence in the epigenetic markers. Each one of these diamonds refers to a particular epigenetic marker. And when we get up into the light blue over here, this refers to a statistically significant difference in epigenetic markers. And one of these over here that I've put a black line around is DLX1, which encodes a transcription factor involved in the formation and maintenance of a distinct set of GABAergic interneurons. And it produces a neuropeptide hormone, NPY, that interacts with the HPA axis. And animal models show that NPY modulates the stress response and anxiety. We know that stress responses are inhibited by GABA, and NPY in fact inhibits GABA, thereby exciting a stress response. And the twin who stayed at home, the one who pursued law, who had a quiet domestic life, basically had this epigenetic marker, which a co-twin did not have. There was a real difference between the two when it came to this particular marker, which, I know it's just an N of 1, and one doesn't want to overinterpret, but it does give us clues as to how one individual can differ from another so markedly in terms of their behaviors while still having the same genetic makeup. So in the interest of time, I need to bring my talk to a close. We've done a number of other interesting studies looking at how journalists discriminate facial affect and how this can change after your response to combat and war. I'll just leave you with a final thought, which is, in the West, in Western newsrooms, the argument has been won that it is essential for news organizations to provide psychological help to journalists who do difficult work. BBC, CNN, Reuters, all provide counseling to their staff. Step outside the Western world, go into many places in Africa, Asia, the Middle East, and there is no discussion of this at all. And what my data show and other studies show is that journalists can suffer significantly from emotional factors that come from doing very difficult work. So thank you for your attention, and I'd be happy to take some questions.